Good afternoon and welcome to another Authors at Google event. Today's speaker is writer, editor, conference organizer, and blogger Scott Kirsner, whose latest book is Inventing the Movies. Scott has written for the Boston Globe, the New York Times, Fast Company, Wired, Salon, Business Week, Variety, and a number of other media, and is a founder of 3 conferences on entrepreneurship, including the Future Forward Conference. He's appeared on CNN, NPR, and the Discovery Channel, and as soon as we get this taped and uploaded on YouTube, but actually he's already there. He's here to discuss how industry luminaries like Kodak's George Eastman and MGM's Irving Thalberg thought the talkies were a passing fad, how Bing Crosby helped bring us the VCR, and how innovators like George Lucas and Steve Jobs are constantly at war with those who want to preserve the status quo. Please welcome Scott Kirsner.
Thanks for the great introduction, Ross. It's really fun to be here. I've been to the campus once or twice before, and been involved in writing about YouTube since the early pre-acquisition days. Been involved in using Google Video and some other products, so it's really nice to be here with all of you. I just want to ask before I start for a show of rather than a show of hands, let's do sort of applause and boos, since this is a presentation about the entertainment industry. So would you applaud if you've ever had an idea or tried to introduce a new technology or product that kind of met a brick wall that no one cared about, that people didn't want to adopt? Please applaud. Okay, and would you boo if you've ever felt like, who are these meatheads that don't understand my idea and don't realize that it's going to take over the world? Would you boo? Okay, this is a good audience for this talk. I want to do 3 things here. The first is I want to give you the complete 110-year history of Hollywood from a technological vantage point. The second thing is I want to talk about this dynamic, this sort of love-hate relationship between new technologies and the movie industry. And I actually think Hollywood is really a proxy for any big, successful, established industry in terms of the way that they greet new technologies and new ideas. And just one data point about that, I remember visiting General Motors, their R&D center in Detroit about 5 or 6 years ago, and asking them about hybrids. And kind of it seemed like the Prius was starting to get some momentum, and people were interested in buying the Honda Insight and other early hybrids. And General Motors told me, we've tried electric cars, we had the EV1, Americans don't like the idea of electricity in their cars, and we think that fuel cells, hydrogen fuel cells, are the future. And so just totally dismissed the hybrid moment, told me how few units of the Prius Toyota would sell, and can someone check the stock price of General Motors today? I think it's trending into the negative integers. So I think this is a dynamic that takes place in every industry, even here in the Valley, in some of the most innovative companies. They run into this clash of sort of new ideas versus people who want to keep doing things the way they've always done them. I was at, I feel it was very interesting giving this talk at Disney down in Burbank yesterday. And it's a company that shows up in the book a few times and shows up in the presentation, and is a great example of a company that has both been on the right side of innovation, as you'll see in the presentation, and then also sometimes can find itself on the wrong side of innovation. We can talk about that a little bit more later. I want to just kind of spin through some movie clips and some slides. I'm interested in taking your questions or your comments at any point, so feel free to chime in, and I'll make sure we leave time for questions at the very end. So let me know if you can identify these 2 people. Anybody in our audience here?
Thomas Edison.
Yeah, Thomas Edison's on the right, but does anyone know who's on the left there holding the flexible celluloid film?
John McCain.
He was probably about John McCain's age when this picture was taken. I like this audience. So on the left is George Eastman, the founder of Kodak, and this is taken in the 1890s when Eastman had just come up with the idea of, perfected the process of making flexible celluloid film. Before that, if you think of the Civil War and Matthew Brady, right, they were taking photographs on glass plates, which were not really good for running through a movie camera at 24 frames a second. Edison was the inventor of the movie camera, and I really look at these 2 guys and what they were doing in the northeastern United States in the 1890s as the beginning of the movie industry. So if you happen to be in Manhattan walking down Fifth Avenue in 1894, April 14th of 1894, it was a Saturday, you would have been among the first people in the world to pay to see movies. And the device that Edison invented as a movie viewing device was called the kinetoscope. And it looked like this. You can see there's a cat's cradle of a film running through it. There was a window at the top left that you would look into, and you'd pay a quarter to get into a kinetoscope parlor, and you'd be able to watch these 30-second movies for a quarter. And there were usually 10 or 12 of them. They were black and white. They were silent. And this is really the beginning of the movies, the kinetoscope parlor. The idea took off really quickly. This is a kinetoscope parlor from that same era in San Francisco. I think you can tell that because there's that peacock on the wall, fine sense of interior decoration. And this is the sort of movie that you might have seen in a kinetoscope parlor in the 1890s. So it's a Brazilian aerialist kind of just doing his routine. It's not known whether this guy ever had children, but hugely entertaining at the time, right? The idea of capturing reality, capturing life, and playing it back on film, it just had never been done before. So people were enchanted by the idea of kinetoscope parlors, and they opened up in San Francisco and London and all over the world. It was a great business for Edison. And so here's what Edison said. I'll give you a second to read the quote, because it's a great one. So the idea of a screen machine was, of course, a movie projector. And Edison, this is pre all the great Bill Gates and Ken Olsen quotes about technology and kind of their potential. This is Thomas Edison, the iconic American innovator, saying, I don't really think there's going to be much of a market for movie projectors. We've already built this great business of kinetoscopes and movie cameras, and we have a studio in New Jersey where we're shooting all these movies. Why kill the goose that laid the golden egg? So from the very beginning of the movies, you see this dynamic of people who built successful businesses saying, new technologies really aren't going to apply to us. And the interesting thing about Edison was other people working on movie projectors, and once Edison saw that actually, people do like this communal experience of movies, they like the bigger screen, they like sort of laughing along with an audience, Edison said, I better license some movie projector technology. So he licensed some technology developed by other people and put the Edison brand on it and made it seem like Edison had invented this movie projector, and then kind of kept his business trucking along.
Wait a minute, you ain't heard nothing yet. Wait a minute, I tell you, you ain't heard nothing. You want to hear Toot Toot Tootsie? All right, hold on. No, listen, play Toot Toot Tootsie, 3 choruses, you understand? And the third chorus, I whistle. Now give it to him hard and heavy. Go right ahead. Toot Toot Tootsie, goodbye. Toot Toot Tootsie, don't cry. The little choo-choo train that takes me away from you. You don't know just how sad it makes me. Kiss me pretty and then, ow, ow, do it over again. Watch for the mail, I never fail. If you don't get a letter, then you know I'm in jail. Hey, hey, don't cry, Tootsie, don't cry. Kiss me, Tootsie, goodbye.
I just wanted to get to the whistling solo because I love that part. So does anyone know the movie? And the star is Al Jolson, yes. So 1927, people often think of this as the first talkie, the first time people had tried to synchronize images on the screen to sound, and it actually was not. People had tried lots of times before, including Edison, and the problems were just that the amplification technology wasn't good enough at the time, and no one could really figure out how to make the synchronization work. There were also some people who actually did make some technological leaps, a company called Phonophone, but they couldn't get stars to perform in their movies because they were sort of Hollywood outsiders. So jazz singer wasn't the first attempt to do talkies, but I look at it as this moment where the industry really leapt forward because the Warner Brothers, there actually were at one point 4 Warner Brothers who started the studio. They hired a great star to be in the movie. The guy practically jumps off the screen, 75, 80 years later, and he can whistle too. It's the whole package. But they bet on a technology that was just good enough to work. And I think that a lot of times in industries, you see people who say, look, let's just wait for 4 or 5 years. The technology will get better. It'll get cheaper. The standards battles will all be settled. We'll bet on the technology then. The Warner Brothers, with the jazz singer, you can see it actually starred. I love Cantor Rosenblatt was one of the stars of this movie. Here's what people said after The Jazz Singer came out. Sound is a passing fancy, and other people thought that talkies and silent movies would always coexist. Both technologies would survive. I want to show you, this is what a projection booth would have looked like around the time of The Jazz Singer. You can see there's still a record player here. The soundtrack was on a record. It could scratch, it could break, lots of things could happen. It wasn't perfect technology at all. It was really brittle technology, but they figured out how to have the same motor driving the projector and the record, right? So it would always be at the same speed. You had to be really an expert at starting the film at the exact right frame and starting the record at the exact right groove in the record. I mean, this was not reliable technology, but it was just good enough to work. And it really, the success of The Jazz Singer really catapulted Warner Brothers from kind of being a second-tier, third-tier studio. They were mostly known for the Rin Tin Tin movies, starring the German Shepherd, into the top ranks of Hollywood and helped them buy the studio lot that they still occupy down in Burbank. I want to show you what a Warner Brothers Vitaphone record would have looked like, just because this is funny to me. When your projection is showing The Jazz Singer, you checked off the number of times you'd played the record because after 20 times you needed a new record. It got too scratched. So Warner Brothers, to support the talkies, had to have this business of every week or two shipping out new records to every theater that was playing The Jazz Singer. So not a perfect technology, but they were willing to take the risk and say, we think it can work. It barely worked, and it just really did wonders for the studio. And turn them into, they're still down there in Burbank today making movies. I want to show you this just to mention that a lot of times, as you know, the sort of initial technology standard that makes something happen doesn't really survive. So the Warner Brothers standard was a record, yoked to the same motor that's running the projector. This was a different standard that Fox was using at the time, which was called optical sound or sound on film. And their idea was like print the sound information next to the picture, and then you don't have any issues with synchronization. It's always right there next to the frame. And that's the standard that really survived, even though it had nothing to do with The Jazz Singer. I love the Technicolor story, and it's in the book, both because I'm from Boston, and very few people know that Technicolor was founded in Boston in this railroad car in 1915. And it's a great story about just how persistent innovators have to be over a really long period of time. I thought that this wouldn't work from, there we go. This is the inside of the railroad car, and their brilliant idea was that they were pretty sure that movie production was not going to be centered in Boston, even in 1915. They knew that the weather in the winter was just too cold, so they said, we'll put our company into a railroad car. They have the office there with all that high tech, like a typewriter, and they had a film processing lab so that they could actually process film, and just attach our headquarters to any train going anywhere that they're making a movie. So the first movie that they worked on was in Jacksonville, Florida. Just find a train going to Jacksonville and bring our headquarters there. Kind of a cool idea. The guys at Technicolor, two of them were MIT alums, so the name Technicolor was kind of an ode to the tech. The third guy didn't go to college, but was just sort of a mechanical whiz. And they became obsessed with the idea that movies weren't always intended to be in black and white. And they started working in 1915 on the idea of, this medium should really reflect the world that we live in and be able to capture the colors of the real world. So the first ally that they found was Douglas Fairbanks, who wanted to make this pirate movie in Technicolor, but it was really a disaster. The process at the time wasn't really good at replicating the colors of the real world. It couldn't do a blue sky, so the skies would always look a little greenish or grayish. And when you ran the Technicolor prints through a projector at the time, they tended to get warped, and they would be out of focus. And so Fairbanks basically gave up on Technicolor and said, I don't think this is ready for real use in the movie industry. But luckily, the Technicolor guys found another friend in Hollywood, this animator named Walt Disney, who was really still making his reputation in the industry. And Disney had started to work on this short film, Flowers and Trees, in black and white. And he saw the Technicolor had really improved the process. They changed it from a 2-color process to a 3-color so they could actually get red, green, and blue, all the important hues on film. And Disney had started to work on this, and he actually told his animators, wipe off the black and white ink from your cells. We're going to start this in color, sort of go back to the very beginning and do it in color. just so you know that all these problems that innovators have, kind of getting people to believe in them and their ideas, it's just it's a perpetual issue for people in any industry. United Artists, who were distributing Disney's movies at the time, this was 1932 that this came out, basically said, Walt, we understand you want to make this movie in Technicolor, but you can pay any extra expenses of making it in color. We're just not sure it's worth it. But we'll still distribute the movie for you like we distribute all your movies. So Walt really took the risk himself. And he actually won his first Academy Award for this movie, Flowers and Trees. After Flowers and Trees came out, though, what does the industry say about it? I mean, with the quotes already, you can kind of guess. They say, Technicolor is great for cartoons, but we really don't think it applies to live action movies at all. That serious movies really should be in black and white. Luckily for the Technicolor guys, this is a fun story that's in the book. The founder, Herb Kalmus, liked playing the ponies at the racetrack. He was at Saratoga Springs one day, and he met this guy, John Jock Whitney, who was a member of the Whitney family. Obviously, you can tell from this picture, he's a really serious businessman, right, on the cover of Time in his, I don't know if that's a riding outfit or polo outfit or something. Rich guy, wanted to get into the movie industry. He meets the founder of Technicolor, who still hasn't, been able to get his technology adopted by Hollywood broadly. And Whitney helps option a novel and decides that he wants to shepherd this novel to the screen. The other movie that came out in 1939 that probably people have seen more frequently was this movie with, Are You Nodding 'Cause You Know? Someone should shout it out. 1939, Judy Garland was in it. There was a dog. The Wizard of Oz. And so both of those movies were made in Technicolor. They come out in 1939. Gone with the Wind won the Best Picture Oscar that year and was phenomenally successful at the box office as well. And that was really only the beginning of the tipping point for Technicolor and color in the movies. People said, okay, we understand it's going to be important, but we're still going to make black and white movies because they're cheaper. And it wasn't until the 40s and 50s when this new technology started to show up in people's living rooms, providing them black and white entertainment for free, called television, that the movie industry said, oh yeah, now we need to shift over wholesale to color because we have to compete with this new business threat, television, that's showing up in people's living rooms. So I mentioned television, and the 50s were this incredibly fertile era for Hollywood because television came along and they had to figure out what technologies, what gimmicks, what new ideas are going to keep people coming out to the movie theaters and buying tickets. Because for a lot of the 50s, Hollywood and TV were two separate things. The movie studios said, we're not going to sell our movies to television. They can't pay enough money for them. So they would keep their stars from appearing on TV because they worried that it would hurt box office sales. The idea of like showing up on Conan or Letterman to promote a movie hadn't occurred to them yet. So there was this succession of great technologies from the technology with the Tingler. You guys should mock it up in this theater for the next authors at Google Talk, because the technology was called Percepto, the newest and most startling gimmick on the screen. And the idea is that you would rig up a joy buzzer underneath like 10% of the seats in the movie theater. And at those key moments when the Tingler attacked, you'd set off the joy buzzers. And so people would leap out of their seats screaming. No one told them that this was going to happen to them. And the idea was that if the Tingler was attacking you and you screamed, that was what would save your life. So really important technology. The originator of this technology, Percepto, was this guy, William Castle, who shows up in the book, and he just had so many great ideas about how, you might dismiss them as this kind of silly, but it was how do we get people to keep, how do we make the movies this experience that you can't have anywhere else? One of his other ideas was, in a movie called House at Haunted Hill, which they just remade a year or two ago, he had a hidden box up to the right of the screen. And at a key moment in the movie, the box would pop open and a skeleton would fly on a guy wire over the audience. And people just went ape. I mean, you can't imagine what it was like. Bing Crosby and, and Danny Kaye. Ross, you got that one. Point for Ross. The thing that very few people know about Bing Crosby is that we wouldn't have the VCR if it weren't for Bing Crosby. And Bing had a radio show around the same time, and he kind of preferred the idea of pre-recording. He liked the idea of being in the recording studio where you could take the best take of any song, and if he made a funny joke as an ad-lib, you could keep that and use it. He didn't so much like the idea of performing live on the radio. And in these days, you actually had to perform twice for every radio show. You did an East Coast feed for New York, and you did a West Coast feed for Los Angeles. So Bing hired an engineer to import some audio recording technology from Germany and help him figure out how can I pre-record my radio show. The network, NBC, was the radio network that carried his radio show, and they didn't like the idea of him pre-recording it because all radio was live. It's supposed to be live. And so Bing actually had to switch networks when he decided to start recording his show from NBC to ABC. But this recording engineer said, Bing, you're also starting to do some TV appearances. Why don't we see if we can hack this audio recording technology and figure out how to make it also record video? So really the first attempt to build a prototype VCR was in Bing Crosby's labs. They called it Crosby Video. It was very fuzzy. The tape ran at an insanely high rate of speed. The sound wasn't really good, but they actually made a VCR work. Crosby later sold off that group to 3M, and the company that really kind of was the next step in video recording was Ampex, which you still pass on the 101 going up to San Francisco, and they really made the first video recorder that a TV station could buy if they wanted to record content. Then you have this next sort of the consumerization or democratization of the VCR, the Betamax, which one or two of you are old enough to remember the Betamax. Watch whatever, whenever. And Hollywood just freaked out about the Betamax. The first time, there's an interesting episode where Sony sent an ad like this to Universal Pictures and said, we want to mention 2 of your TV shows in the ad. And the idea is that we're going to let people watch one of these TV shows live and record the other one because they want to catch, I think it was both Kodak and Columbo were on at the same time. And the Universal's response was to sue Sony and say, we don't like the idea of the Betamax. And Disney, who we saw a few slides ago as this innovator banking on Technicolor, joined the lawsuit. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court. This is what the motion picture industry said about the VCR in 1982. It's a great quote. Unfortunately, Jack Valenti passed away within the last year, but he was an incredible public speaker and advocate for the industry. And no one else would have said, the VCR is to the American film producer as the Boston Strangler is to the woman home alone. So note the year, 1982. By 1990, Hollywood's earning more money from home video than it's earning from theatrical ticket sales. So you see something yet again looking like a threat initially, looking like something that really isn't going to help us, suddenly turning into this incredible bonanza. Sumner Redstone, who some of you know is the chairman of Viacom, said about home video that it was really, in the 70s and 80s, it was really the thing that saved the movie industry, kind of having these newfound home video revenues. So just remember that guy. He comes back later in the presentation. The movie was The English Patient from 1996, I think, and since then, in the intervening 12 years, he's apparently been typecast as someone who is really good at diffusing bombs and handling stressful situations. The thing that's important about The English Patient, it was the first movie to win the Best Editing Oscar to have not been edited by cutting pieces of film. It used a digital editing system called the Avid, which company's still around, still very important. But this was the technology that movie editors used for most of the 20th century. It was called the Moviola, and it's this this very physical editing experience. You see it has pedals. It's almost like driving a car. But it was really all about looking at film, cutting it, and splicing it back together. And editors really had to have this incredible knowledge with their assistants of, I remember where there was a really good take of that kissing scene. Do you know where it is? And the assistant would literally run to hooks where the film was hanging on hooks and pull, oh, here's the kissing scene. Is this the one that you mean? So it was not a great way of accessing if you'd shot, a couple hundred hours of film to try to figure out where everything was. But when people tried to introduce the computer to editing, this was the response. So movie editors were artists. They were really good at what they did. When people like Avid tried to introduce computers, these were guys who really almost couldn't type. They didn't have to use a keyboard in their work. And so here's Avid saying, we've got this system. We're going to digitize all your footage. We're going to give you access to anything. You'll be able to try, in the same time that you used to be able to try one cut and see if it worked, to cut from the kissing scene to the scene of the, ex-boyfriend lurking in the alleyway. you can try 15 different cuts in that same time and see which is the best cut for the movie. They basically just said, no, we're comfortable with the idea of cutting film and splicing it together. We don't want digital to have anything to do with us. These are just some images around that period. Up on the left is Walter Murch, who lives up in Bolinas and works on a lot of the Francis Ford Coppola movies. And he was the guy who edited The English Patient and was one of the first kind of mainstream editors to say, I think our field is going to go digital, and let's learn it, let's embrace it. Up on the right, George Lucas had developed this system called the Edit Droid, even before Avid, and the idea was it used laser discs to give you kind of better access to all the footage you shot. You can see, he almost designed the system to look like you could put that in a Star Wars movie and that guy, that's on the Death Star, right? And then the picture on the bottom is Bill Warner, a guy totally had nothing to do with the movie industry, was working for a mini computer company called Apollo Computer in Boston back in the heyday of the Route 128 tech cluster, and just kind of started to realize that his company was having problems editing its promotional and marketing videos on videotape. It was taking a lot of time. And he said, so we've got these mini computers. I wonder if we could digitize footage. And that was kind of the beginning of this whole transformation of the industry. And today, there's really only one director who insists on still cutting his movies on film. He's fairly well known. He's the guy who did the Indiana Jones movie this year, War of the Worlds, E.T., Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Pixar, Monsters, Inc. I don't actually remember the year. Someone is on IMDb and they'll in the audience, and they'll refresh my memory. But this guy, Ed Catmull, is really the founder, in my mind, of Pixar. And in the 1980s, he was studying computer graphics at the University of Utah. And he was just one of the first people on the planet that looked at computers and said, one day, these are going to be able to make animated movies, at a time when just no one believed that was going to happen. And really, over the first decade of his quest to make animated movies using computers, you could do wireframe, really bad-looking kind of vector-based animations. You could create these really pristine, high-resolution still images, but you just couldn't do anything that looked like a Disney animated movie, that looked like a Snow White, Cinderella type movie. And so Catmull, some of you know the story, hooked up with George Lucas and had a job there for a while. He met John Lasseter, who had been an animator at Disney. Disney just didn't understand Lasseter's interest in technology. This is a picture of the Pixar headquarters these days over in Emeryville. And this is what Catmull told me about going to visit Disney and try to show them what they were working on through a lot of the 1980s and 90s. The animators at Disney would look at it, and it kind of was an interesting science fair project, and they thought it was funny that this guy was trying to make computers, to enable computers to make animated movies, but they didn't really think it had anything to do with their art form at all. And so Pixar would sell a little bit of software to Disney throughout the years, but they kind of continued on separate trajectories until about 2 years ago, Disney realized what Pixar had done and how successful their movies had become, and bought the company for $7.5 billion. Incidentally, Lucas, when he sold Pixar to Steve Jobs, it was for $5 million and a promise that Jobs would also invest another $5 million in the company. So nice return for Steve Jobs. The interesting thing, Lucas was doing two things when he reinvigorated the Star Wars franchise, whatever you think of the movies. One is he really wanted to project them digitally. He felt like the issue you have when you send out film to movie theaters is that every time you run it through the projector, it gets worse looking. It gets scratches, it accumulates dust. And so his movies would run for a couple months. If you went to see it in month 2 of the release, it was not a great experience. So he used this movie to try to start pushing digital projection into theaters. That's a story that is still going on. We're at about 10 to 12% of the movie theaters in the US where you have a digital projector. Haven't reached the tipping point there yet. But the other thing he wanted to do was start using a digital camera, because it seemed ridiculous to him that if you're doing all these computer-generated effects, why are you shooting it on film and then scanning it so you can work on it in a computer, which is a couple $100,000 every time you decide to scan an entire movie into the computer. And so he talked to Sony and convinced them, after a lot of persuading, to adapt one of their cameras that had been designed for TV for use in the movies. And this is a picture of George with that camera. They call it the Sony Cine Alta camera. You can see that cinematographers, once they get a digital camera, they want it to look and act just like a movie camera. So there's the markers for writing on the slate what take it is, and there's still this special knob because on a movie set there's a guy whose job is just to turn that knob and adjust the focus. Like that's an important standalone job on a movie set. This is just a picture of where the cinematographers hang out in Hollywood. It's right around the corner from where they have the Academy Awards. It's called the American Society of Cinematographers Clubhouse. And all the guys who were trying to introduce digital cameras to Hollywood would go here and present to the sort of royalty of Hollywood cinematographers, and the cinematographers would explain why the resolution wasn't good enough, or what features it didn't have, or you just need to work on it another 5 or 10 years before we want to shoot our movies with it. And Lucas did a really interesting thing with that movie, The Phantom Menace, which is the camera wasn't quite ready to use for the entire movie. Sony just hadn't finished the first working prototype. But he said at the very end, he said, I'm going to shoot some background imagery that we're going to use in the movie with this digital camera. And then when the movie came out, he could play this interesting trick on all the cinematographers who thought that the camera wasn't ready for prime time. And he said, all right, if digital cameras are so bad, why don't you tell me all the shots in the movie that have digital imagery in them? And no one could do it. You just couldn't tell. And this is when I talked to George for the book. This is what he said about those experiences. I have this term called preservationists, and it really applies to anyone who wants to preserve the status quo. And so Lucas has this feeling after trying to introduce lots of new technologies that their response to anything new is they want to come up with reasons why it's not going to work. I think I have one more clip to show you, and then we'll go into Q&A here.
Evolution of dicks.
So just out of curiosity, has everyone in this audience, show of hands, you've seen this video before? Oh, wow. I thought it was like part of the orientation at Google where they showed you evolution of dance. Go watch it if you haven't seen it. It's hugely entertaining, and it's, I think, still the most viewed video on YouTube. When I pulled this down the other day, 100 million views. Far more views than any episode of Seinfeld ever got at the peak of that series' popularity. And this is where Hollywood is right now, is trying to figure out what is this new world where so much attention and so much viewing is shifting to the internet and internet-delivered video. And man, I was down there doing some meetings yesterday, and it is still just this giant, pretzel that they're trying to figure out. How do we continue our business and continue the creativity in this world where it's suddenly free, basically, for anyone to make and distribute video? When I interviewed Judson Lapley, he's basically a motivational speaker who tours college campuses, and he shot this video for the cost of a DV tape. He's literally set up the camera in the back of the auditorium, started it, and did his act. I mean, talk about low production values. The thing that I also like to point out is that if you think about this video and then the video that we watched at the beginning of the woman dancing and the Brazilian tightrope guy, it's almost the same thing, right? It's someone doing something goofy or interesting or entertaining for the camera. There's no fancy camera moves, right? There's no editing at all. It's just kind of one shot. And so it's interesting to me that YouTube in its early days was stylistically really similar. Everything on YouTube that was really popular is pretty short, right? Stylistically very similar to those early Edison movies. And the other thing that made movies at that time popular was there was no dialogue, so lots of people could enjoy them even if they didn't speak English. I think if you did analysis of popular videos on YouTube and other video sharing sites, not a lot of dialogue. So our friend Sumner Redstone, as you know, has kind of a beef with YouTube. And this is what he said about it. You cannot pay the rent posting videos on YouTube. I just am really interested in that dynamic of someone seeing how important home video was and how Hollywood figured out how to translate its business into that new world, looking at YouTube and internet video and saying, this is not a business. So just a couple last kind of idea slides. I think in every industry you have these three kinds of people. You have the innovators who are advocates for new technology, who develop it, who try to get it applied. You have the preservationists who just want to hold on to the status quo and they want to fight to keep things the way that they are. And you have, I think the biggest group of people are the people in the middle who kind of don't care. They're aware that there's some kind of transition, change, battle going on, but they're not really taking sides. When the battle gets decided, they'll say, all right, yeah, we'll use Blu-ray instead of HD DVD. They're kind of not real influencers. But I think in different situations, all of us can be an innovator in one situation and be a preservationist in another. So we saw with Edison and projection, right? He invented the industry, but then he didn't like the idea of projection. Spielberg has been such an innovator in terms of visual effects and the Jurassic Park movies, and also really helped introduce digital sound to movie theaters in the 1990s. But he still wants to shoot all of his movies on film. Disney and the VCR kind of playing different sides of the fence there. And even George Lucas, who we think of as the quintessential innovator in the movie industry, still writes all his scripts on a yellow legal pad. And someone else's job to type up those scripts. I think throughout the presentation, and probably in your experiences, there are these three kinds of change: business model change, process change, and cultural change. And all of them are really, really hard when you run up against them. People don't want to change when they think they know what the culture of their company is. At a place like Disney, for example, anything that seems to threaten that, or even Pixar today, I think they know what the Pixar culture is. And if you suggest something different, like, yeah, we should be making movies for cell phones that are 45 seconds long and are advertising supported, I think they would say, that's not the Pixar culture. And innovators, most of the time, are so focused on developing a new technology, developing a new product, that I don't think they spend enough time really thinking about all these different factors that cause people to resist change. And it's really an endless list that I just put up a few bullet points about. People worry about losing their status. It doesn't fit into the way that they work. Most technologies, when they're first introduced, are not reliable enough. They're not high quality enough. A lot of the industry looked at YouTube and said, people aren't going to watch those, grainy video. It's not high quality. We're living in an HD world. This isn't going to work. I think just one or two last points here. I think innovators always really underestimate the importance of partnerships. We saw it with Technicolor, right, where they needed not just Douglas Fairbanks and not just Walt Disney and not just Jock Whitney, but also the fact, many other partnerships that we haven't mentioned to make Hollywood understand and adopt this new technology. So it's not always just about that you've built a better product. And I want to wrap up with two quotes here from the book. I'll give you a second to read it. So you can see that people get very attached to the ways that they've learned to do something and the culture that they've grown up in. And it's pretty difficult. I mean, Lucas tried to convince Spielberg to shoot the latest Indiana Jones movie digitally, and it just didn't work. I mean, he's someone who's very attached to film and the movie culture that he grew up in. And then on the flip side, you have someone like James Cameron, who says, what haven't you done yet? That's the only interesting thing to be doing. And right now, he worked with Sony to develop this new 3D digital camera. He's shooting a movie called Avatar that's going to be out next year. So someone who really feels energized and motivated by doing new stuff. I'd love to, to take some questions or take some comments from you. It's been fun just sort of coming here to Google after giving this talk at other places. Obviously, the YouTube Sumner Redstone nexus is kind of an interesting one that maybe we could talk about. But I'd love to just first thank you for being here and being such a great audience today, and take any questions that you might have. And I'm supposed to repeat the questions. Ross told me.
microphone over there.
I should mention that there's a bunch of material up on the URL there, the Inventing the Movies website, sort of lots of material that isn't in the book. So yes, one question.
Well, it's a bit more of a comment, but maybe it could, further some discussion. I think that in your breakdown of people into, and maybe you can help me remember the three, but
innovators, preservationists, and sideline sitters.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that there's an equally important axis you have to consider, which is self-aggrandizing self-promoters. Because.
But they can fall into any of those categories, right?
Absolutely. And the thing I just want to point out is that it's true that some of the aspects of how the cinematography community has taken to digital cinematography, or kind of said, hold off. It's not quite fair of George Lucas to claim that he made the change when he's not, in fact, a cinematographer. So going and saying they all are doing the wrong thing and I made this happen. Well, he's basically functioning in this role as a producer, where he has the money and the resources and the control to say, we're going to do it this way. And also, at the time he did it, there weren't any cameras. I mean, Sony literally built those cameras for him. So for him to claim that these other cinematographers refused to use the technology, it's technology that he basically paid for, whether through some combination of money or influence.
Yeah, that's a great point. I guess the two responses that I have to that are, since then, lots of other people have developed digital cameras for the movies, and still, this year, maybe 5% of movies will be shot digitally. The rest are still going to be shot on film. So I do think that it's gone a little bit beyond the camera that he developed, and there are lots of other options. The other point that I would make is that you often have these clusters or coteries of people who want to really protect their art form, their craft, the job that they do in the world. And sometimes you do need an outsider to say, hey guys, there's a better way to do this. And even though you're happy to keep doing it the way you're doing it forever and ever and ever, there's another solution that can maybe improve the process, maybe lower the costs, whatever it is. I mean, the thing that gets sticky with the movies is that it's an art form, right? I mean, no one ever went to oil painters and said, like, all right, guys, you need to switch to photography. And yet, there were people that saw the potential of photography and later the potential of making video and film as an art form and said, this is something I want to do. So I don't like the idea of sort of forcing a whole group of people to sort of create or practice their art form differently, but I'm just fascinated by the sometimes walls that go up where people say en masse, we're not going to adopt that, stay away from us. And you've got something that clearly is going to improve the way that they work or make new things possible. I mean, the thing that's funny about cinematography, since you're interested, people would literally say, Spielberg said to me that he likes the moment. When you're shooting on film, you basically have 8 to 10 minutes of film in the canister, and then you stop and you reload the camera, right? And when you stop, everyone suddenly rushes in and they put more makeup on the actors and they adjust everyone's costumes and they move the props back to where they need to be. So it's maybe 10 minutes of shooting and then 10 minutes of doing all of that stuff. And Spielberg said, I like hearing the cinematographer whisper to me, we're about to run out. Like that urgency in that moment of like, you have to make everything happen in those 8 minutes. He likes that constraint. And then there are other people that I've talked to who like the fact that, there was this Adam Sandler movie called Click that was shot digitally, and like the fact that you just keep the camera running and like let Adam Sandler do what he does over and over again, and you don't have to worry that he's going to do something funny in the 5 or 10 minutes when the cameras aren't rolling and people are there with the makeup and resetting the props. So it's a really good point, and I'm glad that you made it. So happy to answer any other questions or comments. At least one more here.
Hi, thanks again for coming. I was wondering how you found your way to this research.
Well, Hollywood's just a lot of fun to write about. And I'm someone, I'm interested in innovation and how it gets introduced to the world, and had written about a lot of different industries from, the automotive industry to aviation to, financial services to a lot of tech companies in Boston and in the Valley. And I was lucky enough to get invited to this event at Skywalker Ranch where Lucas brought together a bunch of the key innovators right now. And so it was James Cameron and the Pixar guys and Robert Zemeckis, who did the Back to the Future movies. And it was so interesting to me that these guys are clearly like rich, powerful, A-list directors at the center of Hollywood, and they were still complaining that it was so hard to get their ideas adopted, whether it was projecting digitally, whether it was shooting on green screens, or whether it was bringing 3D to movie theaters. And so that just struck me as, well, if these guys have that issue and Hollywood has that issue, that it would be a really interesting case study that I think people in any industry can read and say, a lot of these dynamics are at play in my industry too. This clash of people who want to bring in new ideas and lots of people who want to explain to you why we don't need any new ideas in our industry. And I also think that just the last thing to touch on is that Hollywood is a great example of an industry that started in the 1890s and thanks to technological innovation is still here today. I mean, no one thinks that we'd still be going to kinetoscope parlors to watch 30-second black and white silent movies today, not even for a quarter. People wouldn't do it. So the innovation really mattered and really helped the industry survive. So any last questions? Thanks to all the people in the remote offices for staying and listening. Thanks for tuning in. And thanks for waving, too. That was nice. So one last time, just thanks for having me in here. It was really fun to talk to all you guys. And I'm happy to sign books if you want to devalue them in that way. So thank you.